Hello everyone, welcome to the GL Studio webinar. We'll get started here in about 3 minutes. Hello everyone, again welcome to today's webinar on GL Studio. We'll begin here shortly. We're going to give it just another minute or two here just to make sure that everyone that wants to attend is going to join, then we'll get started. Okay. Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar on GL Studio. Today we'll be covering importing into GL Studio with some of our various importers that we have implemented. My name is Blake Gates. I'm the lead support engineer for the GL Studio team. And a few things to cover on the webinar before we get started. One, those of y'all who are attending, this will be a recorded webinar. And those of you that registered for it will get a copy of the recorded webinar as well as the slides that I'm using here. And two, as I'm going through the webinar, if you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and add those to the Q&A. And as we get towards the end, I'll start addressing those questions at the end. a quick high-level view at some of the topics that we'll be covering today. Again, we'll be covering importing into GL Studio. First, we're going to cover just the base texture system in GL Studio. We'll cover this very briefly as most of our importers are going to utilize that system once it's inside GL Studio, but we'll topically cover what that looks like. And then we'll get into some of the importers that we have base that come with GL Studio, such as our Photoshop importer, our Figma importer, Ase Importer, and SVG Importer. And then we'll get a little bit into the actual import scripts themselves that are written within our Python system and how you might edit those or create your own for new importers. And then, as I mentioned, as we get towards the end, we'll go over any questions that we have in the Q&A section. So as you have those questions, please feel free to add those in there. So before we get into the import topics today, just a little bit of an overview of Disty itself. We've been around since 1994. We have over 22 years of experience with both HMI and UI solutions. We are an ISO 9001 certified company. And as far as GL Studio is concerned, over 700 companies in 45 different countries are utilizing GL Studio. So pretty much wherever there is HMI, GL Studio is present there. Now, here's a small select list of some of the customers that are utilizing GL Studio. You can see there's everything from aerospace and defense to automotive companies, all the way to agricultural companies, as well as medical companies. Now, on those companies, some of the successes that we've had in production. So, for example, we have the T-7A Red Hawk with Boeing, which is utilizing GL Studio through its entire process. So, from prototyping to simulation to actually flying in the aircraft. We're also utilizing the XP-1 at Boom Supersonic with the new commercial supersonic jet, as well as the L-93NG on HUD systems flying at Spiel. Now, for automotive, for Hyundai Kia Motors, they're utilizing us in 23 different platforms for both clusters as well as 3D infotainments. And Jaguar Land Rover standardized on us for 9 years on all their vehicles for their in-vehicle infotainment. And then Topcon is using us for their tractor and combine control systems. So all the different markets you see there on the left between automotive, aerospace and defense, agriculture, medical, all utilize GL Studio for their, for various HMI elements. Now, in order to support that, we have to have a robust partner ecosystem with various operating system and hardware providers. So if there's any sort of hardware or operating system that you're deploying to, we work with them. Really, our only requirement is that OpenGL be present. But even then, we have GL Studio Micro, somewhat of a newer addition to GL Studio that allows us to target microprocessors. I think currently it's Infineon hardware is what we have, what we deployed to. But yeah, so that's some of a quick little overview of Disty, GL Studio itself, and where we're utilized. Now we're going to get into the actual topic at hand, which is importers with GL Studio. So as I mentioned before, the first thing that I wanted to cover is the base texture system in GL Studio. So we're going to cover just importing some basic 2D, PNG, JPEG, your standard texture objects, and what that looks like once it's been imported into GL Studio. So all of the imports that we're going to cover today are going to eventually bring those textures into GL Studio using this system. Now, to bring textures into GL Studio, you can drag and drop them in. Those are going to go into the Resources tab. And from the Resources tab, you can actually do things like dynamically apply textures at runtime or modify different settings for those textures. So let's cover adding some textures into GL Studio just in their base form. So this is GL Studio 8.0. It's a brand new project. I don't currently have anything in here other than an iPoint, but I do have some textures that I want to get imported in here. So if I open my Art tab, I have a couple of album covers in here. I have both a JPEG and a PNG version. And all we need to do to get these added into GL Studio is to drag and drop them right into the editor. So when we drag and drop these textures into GL Studio, it'll automatically create a respective polygon object or another object of the resolution of that texture and automatically map and apply that to it. Now, as you add textures into GL Studio, these are going to be added into the Resources tab. So there's various tabs in here for all your resources. This is specifically the Textures tab, and all textures that are referenced by your design are going to be listed out in here. Now, as you use importers, this is where some of those base textures that are generated are going to be added, and you have different functionality in here. So, for example, by default, GeoStudio will generate its textures inline, so the actual color values for the textures will be baked into the source code, so that you don't have a runtime dependency on it. Different options like that you can toggle on and off in the resources tab, and this will apply for the importers to come. So we'll go ahead and hide these, but we'll have them be present within our design. So again, just a really touch and go overview of just base textures. So if you have any sort of PNGs, JPEGs, any standard textures, no problem, just drag and drop those right into GeoStudio and utilize them however you want to utilize them. Now, the first importer that I want to cover is the Photoshop importer. So similar to any standard texture, you can just drag and drop your PSD file directly into GeoStudio, and it will go ahead and parse and import all those layers into GeoStudio. Now, the way our Photoshop importer is going to import that design file is each layer is going to be considered a separate entity in GeoStudio. Essentially, each layer will become its own object in GeoStudio. Now, there is a bit of nomenclature that needs to go into the layer naming inside your Photoshop file. And we'll take a look at that here real quick. Now, from a general standpoint, the way you're going to name your layers is going to be the layer name and then the object type you want to import it as, all within brackets. And here's a small list of the objects that would be supported for import from that layer parsing. We'll go ahead and get a Photoshop file imported here into GeoStudio. So same as before. We're going to go into our art directory and have a couple of Photoshop files in here, but I'm just going to grab this gauge and drag and drop this in here. Now we'll take a look at what the Photoshop file looks like in just a second, but let's go ahead and get this imported in here. Okay, so you can see that I do have some objects that have been added into my design, and I have a new PSD import object. So if we take a look at this and drop this down, you can see there are a series of groups that have been added. And within these groups are polygons, there are text boxes, there are all sorts of different GeoStudio objects that have been imported with this. Now, next to this PSD import is a magnifying glass icon. Now, if you haven't seen this before, this icon in GeoStudio means that this particular object is referencing an external file. And you can see with this object selected, if we go into the object properties, that it is referencing that PSD that I drag and dropped right into the scene. Now, if you click on this, it will open whatever external file is being referenced in whatever tool it came from. So if it's, for example, this can be utilized for components in GeoStudio, it'll open it in GeoStudio. If it's a Photoshop file, it'll open it in Photoshop, or later on when we cover the Ase Importer, it'll open it in 3ds Max or whatever respective tool that came from. So now we're taking a look at the actual Photoshop file itself. Now, two things to note here as far as the layering convention is concerned. The first part is that you will need to have a top level layer that is named either GLS component or GLS app. This essentially tells our importer that everything within this layer is what you want to consider for importing to GeoStudio. So down here at the bottom, I have a layer 1, 3, and 0 for some background. They are not in this component layer, so they will not be considered for import. Now, the second thing that you can see is as we look through the different layers in here, each of these has their own naming convention with the layer name, as well as what object type you want these to be imported as. So group, text box, things like that. And as we go through this, if you look back in GeoStudio, the layers that are present in our Photoshop design go one-to-one with what was imported into GeoStudio. Now, one additional thing that comes with the Photoshop importer is a concept of what's called a catalyzer. Now, I'll cover this a little bit more later on as we get into the actual import system. But essentially what a catalyzer allows to happen is this reference to the original file will also update as changes are made to it. So if I make changes to this Photoshop file, then GeoStudio should catch that there have been changes and automatically re-import. And I can show this real quick. So if we go back into our Photoshop design and we take maybe one of these album covers, we put this in here, we get this applied, we're going to take this layer and we're going to put it inside of our component layer, and we're going to go ahead and add our naming convention. So we'll put it in brackets, we'll add polygon, and then we'll hit save. Now, as we go back to GL Studio, you can see it's already re-importing this object. And now we have an additional layer that has been added in here with the album cover that I just added into the middle of this. And if we go back in here and we delete this layer, and we hit save, again, GL Studio's already caught that there's been a change. It's going to re-import this, and it should remove that object. Now here, very quickly, I'm going to go ahead and run this so we can see what this looks like at runtime. But while I'm running this, I'll note that for most of these importers, note that the file type is what we support. So if there are other tools that would export this file type, for example, I know that that GIMP is able to export Photoshop or PSD format files. They could be imported into GL Studio. So note that the file type is what we're looking for, not necessarily the specific design tool. So there's our design at runtime. So exactly what we saw in Photoshop, exactly what we see in our design window here in GL Studio is exactly what we see at runtime here inside GL Studio. All right, so we're going to hide that layer. Now, before I move on from the PSD importer, if you do need more information on our Photoshop importer, a full reference guide, API nomenclature for the layering system, I have some links here in the slides that go to our Confluence site, our doc site, that cover some of that. So when you get these slides, if you want a direct link to those, you'll have access to these. Now, the next importer that I'd like to cover is our Figma importers. This is one of our more recently added ones. Figma Importer is a little bit unique compared to some other importers, given that Figma is a web-based design tool. So there's not really any files to drag and drop into GL Studio. So instead of dragging and dropping files into GL Studio, what you'll do is you'll create a reference object in GL Studio that already has all the scripts and everything that you need to import applied to it. And you'll give it a web URL for wherever your design is going to exist. And it will automatically import that file for you and update the design based on whatever parameters that you give it. Now, unlike Photoshop, which had a bit of a naming convention with the layers, Figma has a bit of a node system where there are different types of nodes that GL Studio can actually parse to create specific objects with. So you don't need to specifically name your layers per what object type you want to import them as. The only thing that you have to note that I'll show is that those names be C++ compliant. That's really about it. Now, there are a number of options for when you're importing your Figma design. Here's a list of them here. I'll cover them a little bit more once we actually get into the editor, and I'll talk about what these actually do. But the main things to note are you're going to need a URL for your design. You're going to need an access key, which I'll talk on here in a minute, but that's provided by Figma on your account. And then you can pick and choose kind of which frames you actually want to import and how you want to import them. So real quick, let's take a look at a Figma design. So I have a bit of an IVI set up in here in Figma. I have a couple of frames. So I have a music screen frame, I have a map screen frame, as well as a call screen frame. And as I drop each of these down, you can see I have different text objects. I have different polygonal objects. I have different, background objects that have been added in here, but none of these are specifically named anything that would hint at importing this specifically as a polygon or as a text object. Just so you will kind of look at what type of node this is and automatically import that as needed. So if you wanted to import this into GL Studio, so we'll go back into GL Studio. With the Figma importer added as a package, it'll add an object down here. You can see I have a few already for PSD, Ase, and SVG. So this actually technically will work for the other importers if you wanted to manually do what drag and drop does. But we'll go ahead and add a Figma reference in here. So the first thing that we're going to want to add is our access token. Now, again, this is something that is going to be supplied by your actual Figma account. Here's mine. And I will have documentation a bit later on how to get access to that. Okay, so we have our access token. I'm going to turn off this, which is specific for my machine. And then we'll go back into our design, and we're going to right click, and we're going to copy the link to our actual design. So we'll go ahead and paste this in here. And the second that I click out of this frame, it's going to go ahead and download the geometry and textures for that specific design file. Now, since I haven't enabled any other options in here, it's going to import this exactly as is. It's going to import all of the frames. It's going to import all of the layers. It's going to import them exactly as they are laid out in our design there. Now, a couple of things to mention. For the Figma frame names, if you want to only import specific frames, let's say I only wanted to import the map frame, you can list those out in here with a new line delaminated list. If you have certain nodes that you want to be flattened, i.e. they're going to be kind of compressed and rasterized into a single polygon object, you can list those out in here as well. Now, the image scale has to do with how the textures are being imported. So, for example, I'm not going to click because it's going to require a re-import, which will take just a second. But basically, if you want to increase or decrease the texture scale for some of the images that are being imported, you can change that scale right here. Now, the one thing that I do want to do on this is these particular pages are intended to be stacked on top of one another and swapped between. So there is a stack frames option here that I'm going to go ahead and click, and this will re-import the object and kind of realign how these are going to go. And this should stack all of the layers on top of one another. There we go. So now each of my layers has been imported as their own constrained Figma layer. So I have my map layer, I have my music layer, and I have my call layer, just like we saw in our design up there. The same 3 frames that we had are the same 3 objects that we have here in Chill Studio, with all of the imports that came out from them. So we have text objects, we have polygons, we have groups, all dependent on what node type they are in Figma. So as I hide these layers, you can see each of the layers have now stacked on top of one another. And to get this running, we'll go ahead and resize this just a little bit so we can get on our screen. And we'll go ahead and run this as well, just so we can see the design show up at runtime. Excuse me. Now, one thing that I will mention about Figma that it does have a little bit of an advantage over Photoshop, at least as far as difference in use, is Figma is free to utilize. So if you are looking for a bit of a newer option to try out a design tool with, it's free. Figma's a possible choice for that. So if you wanted to give that a try, feel free to grab Figma for free and use our Figma Importer to grab your designs and bring them in here. Okay. So, same as before, I have a little bit of documentation in here that covers how to import a Figma design, what certain nodes are supported, things like that, as well as a link to Figma's website on how to get access to the access token that you'll need to import your designs with. Now, next, we're going to switch gears from some of our 2D design tools to talk on a 3D importer. So this is the Ase Importer. Even though it says 3ds Max here, which is typically what it's used with, again, if there are any modeling tools that export the Ase format, that'll be supported here as well. It's specifically the Ase format that we're looking for, not necessarily from 3ds Max. So things that I want to talk about for 3ds Max are the model hierarchy itself, what values you would want to export with the file that are going to be imported by GL Studio. So you don't necessarily need to have all of those, but I do want to give kind of a full list of everything that would be supported. And same as the others, this is just a drag and drop import. So you can just take that Ase file, drag and drop it right into the editor, and that will import the model for you. Now, some of the values that that are going to be imported or could be imported by GL Studio. So the vertex values, so that's going to be position, color values, things like that for the mesh. Face values, so that's going to be the normal values for the model. GL Studio can generate its own, but if you do have normal values for your faces, I would suggest using those. The texture coordinates, it's going to be key if you have any textures on your models. Animations, so animations in your model will actually be imported into GL Studio. They'll be imported as dynamic path or path manager objects, or dynamic path and path manager objects, apologies. Your materials and textures will be imported. Lights will be imported as light sources, and cameras will be imported as eye points. Now, a little just briefly to touch on materials, the specific materials that are imported or that we will accept. Here's a small list of them. So diffuse materials, specular color materials, normal bump matte materials, reflection materials, and shine materials are imported. Now, I know there are map variants of these materials that exist. Note that we specifically import the material version of these. So as an example that I've seen is the shine material also has a shine map. Note that we are only going to import the shine material itself, not the shine map. And I'll show this when I import, but materials are a lot like textures in that multiple meshes on your model can be referencing the same material. Now, materials are one of the ways that you can modify your model at runtime, for example, giving it different color values, things like that. If you are going to do something like that with your models, if you do need to make, say, different color modifications to it or to specific sections of the model, so you want to click on it and change the color, make sure those areas of the model have unique materials so that when you set those color values, it doesn't apply to everything that has a reference to that material. All right, the same color that we were looking at, we have that open here in 3ds Max. So if we drop down our hierarchy in here, you can see that we have our main body that has a glass, a door, grill, wheels, another door in there. So one thing to mention on the hierarchy is if you are going to have animations applied to them, make sure your hierarchy ordering is correct. Because when they comes into GeoStudio, those animations play, they are going to play from the child or the sub object up to its parent. So do make note of your hierarchy ordering, especially when you're doing animations. Now, the other thing that I'll note is the actual export itself. So I'm not going to actually export because this takes a second. I've already exported one just to kind of have that here. But we'll go ahead and export, and sure, we'll save it here. Just call it car like I did before. We'll do ASE. So when you are exporting, the main things to note as far as what you want to export here are you do want the mesh definitions, materials, and transform animation keys. So the mesh definitions are going to be the actual vertex values for the mesh as well as the normal values. You may want to make sure you have that one. If you have materials applied, this will export the material values, and this is going to export your animation keyframes. And then for the mesh options, which come out with the mesh definitions, you want to grab all of them. You want to make sure you grab the normal values. You want to make sure you grab the texture coordinates. You want to make sure that you grab the vertex colors. The rest of these, I would just leave as is. These usually all come out standard with any of the exporters. But the main things to note here is make sure you're exporting all of the mesh definitions, normals, texture coordinates, and vertex colors, as well as the materials and animations if you have them. So let's go back into GeoStudio. And we will go into our 3D model directory. So here's the optimized car max file that I was currently looking at. And here is a car ASC that I exported from this previously. So we can go ahead and just drag and drop this right into GeoStudio. Now, same as the others, it's going to go ahead and parse that file. It's going to look for any texture files that it's referencing. It's going to look for any materials that it's referencing, and it's going to go ahead and import those into GeoStudio. And just like with our PSD import or our Figma reference, we now have an Ase import file. This is a catalyzer, just like our Photoshop file. So, if you make any modifications to the model, if you re-export that Ase file, GeoStudio will see that there are changes, and they will re-import that design. Now you'll note that currently when I import this car, it's kind of facing upwards towards the sky. And that's actually an auto adjust rotation option in here. The reason for this is because 3ds Max, at least in this case, has a inverted matrix system compared to GeoStudio or compared to standard OpenGL. So to correct that on the import, we go ahead and rotate this to match with the world orientation. Normally, if you're coming from 3ds Max, all you have to do is select this model, and with it selected, hit rotate vertical here at the top. That'll put your model, drop it down to kind of view exactly what you were seeing in your modeling tool. Now I'm going to go ahead and scale this up a little bit so we can see it better. There we go. Now, if we drop down and we take a look at the SVG Import, you'll note that exactly what we saw in the hierarchy listing in 3ds Max, similar to Photoshop, is exactly what we see here on the import. So each of those top level hierarchies, so we have the body, which wasn't exactly a mesh itself, it was just a top level hierarchy, and then each of the meshes within that have now been imported as a GLS advanced mesh object. Now, if you did want to use our other mesh object, GLS tri-mesh, there is an option in the import to import as advanced mesh instead. Typically, you'd want to use advanced mesh, but if you're on an older system and you don't have access to some of the shaders that are being utilized for this, then you could drop this down if you wanted to. So we'll go ahead and we'll position this roughly in the middle of my view. Now you'll note that the car looks a little bit dark compared to what we were looking at. Now the reason for that is since it was imported as an advanced mesh object, by default it is going to be looking for a light in the scene or lighting in the scene. Now I didn't have any lights in my model design, so we'll go ahead and add one in real quick from GL Studio. So we'll just grab a light object, put that in the scene, and now it's actually going to start applying lighting to the vehicle. So we can view this in a 3D viewer here in the editor and see that the front of the car is now lit. This is kind of an infinite sunlight from the front, whereas the back still has shadow cast on it. So we'll go ahead and, same as the others, go ahead and give this a run. Make sure we can see this at runtime. Might be a little bit small. Excuse me. Now, while this is going, I do want to touch on materials. So the materials from your import are going to show up in GL Studio, similar to our texture resources, where you have a list in the texture palette of all the textures. There it goes, pretty far away, but it's there in the scene and it's lit just like we see here. Now, similar to our textures, those materials are going to be added to a material palette here in GL Studio. So if I select any of these mesh objects, and let's see, real chooser, we'll go ahead and find that and we'll pull this up. You'll see that I only had 3 materials that are really applied to this whole model. The first one in here is always going to be a default material. We supply a default material, so this one will always be there. But anything besides that are going to be coming from the import. So I have a model for the body, the tires, and the grills. So the body kind of encompasses the doors, that encompasses the windows. So let's say I wanted to change specifically the color of a door because I've clicked on it or there's an animation playing on it or whatever you want to set up. Right now, if I were to change the material color of the body, it's going to affect everything that's referencing this specific material. So make sure that that if you are going to be doing something like that, each of those does have a unique ID material on them. So when you change it, it just changes for that specific object. All right, we'll go ahead and hide our Ase Import, get rid of our light source that's not hanging out in the scene. And we will move back into here. And just like with the others, we do have some documentation on the Ase Import. I have a few in here that go over some somewhat different sections of importing ASE files. So everything from just our base documentation as far as what hierarchy should you use, what materials are supported, things like that, all the way down to how you could optimize your model for importing to GL Studios, things like reducing the poly count, things like that. So I have a few of those in here. Feel free to give those a look after the webinar. Now, last, this is kind of broken up into 2 sections, but first I want to cover the SVG Importer. And as we cover the SVG Importer, I want to go a little bit more in depth into the actual import system that GL Studio utilizes and how you could edit that or add your own importers into GL Studio. First, for SVG files, we do support vector-based SVG textures. Same as the others, you just drag and drop them right in. GL Studio will automatically create a underlying polygon that will have that texture in it, but as you scale that texture in the editor, it will automatically re-rasterize for the new scale that you've given it. So there are a few things. There's a few things you can change with that. Like I said, you can resize it and re-rasterize that texture. You can also change the pixel density. So depending on how you scale this, you may want to increase or decrease the pixel density to make sure that rasterization looks good. So let's go ahead and import an SVG file into GL Studio. So we'll come back to our design. And I have this quick little call out SVG, and we'll drag and drop this right into here. So you can see as I were to say downscale this, or we'll make it really big. Give that a second, and you can see hopefully you're able to see that, but a split second after I got done scaling this, you saw that the edges that were somewhat jagged and aliased re-rasterized themselves and became a lot more smooth as we increased the scale of this. Now, if I went to maybe a much smaller size, this is re-rasterizing to a much smaller resolution, then what we can do is with this selected, we can go into the object properties, and we'll go to the pixel density and we'll increase this to say 4. And you can see it kind of becomes a lot more smooth. So depending on whether you're increasing this to a much larger size, or if you're decreasing it to a really tiny size and you want to get a much higher fidelity out of it, you can either update the pixel density scale or you can update the scale of the object itself to kind of continue getting that nice smooth vector-based render of that texture. So that's our SVG import. Now I'm going to go ahead and re-import this in its base format, just so we can see what the base import looks like, because we're going to make some slight modifications to this importer here in just a second. So we'll go ahead and drag and drop this back in here. We can see how large it is. We'll move it back over here. Now I want to touch on how these importers have been added into GeoStudio in the first place. Now within projects in GeoStudio, we have a concept of packages. So each of our importers is a package in GeoStudio. So if we scroll down in here, for example, for the SVG importer, you can see that I have an SVG importer that has been added in here. It's the same for the Ase importer. It's the same for the Photoshop importer. They're all in here as packages. Now, each of these importers is based on our Python API. Now, GeoStudio has an underlying Python API that allows you to interface with the editor. Basically, anything that you can do in the editor, from creating objects, adding code, generating code, there is a corresponding Python API call too. Now, our package system, as well as our importers, are all based on that Python API. So if we navigate to the packages directory inside of our project, here are all the packages that I have added into here. And if you go in here, this is our actual SVG importer. So the catalyzer script, so the script that actually runs, that continues the update once changes have been made to the underlying file, exists here in the catalyzer scripts. So this is the actual script that is applied to the object. And if we go back here into the SVG import and we take a look at the script that's attached to this, you can see it's the exact same Python script that exists there within that package. Excuse me. So if we wanted to make any modifications to this, we could. So at the top level of my project, I have an updated Catalyst SVG import.py. So we're going to go ahead and copy and paste this in over the existing import script. And so the modifications that I've made to this are I'm changing the actual import scale that everything comes in at. So basically, instead of importing at this really large size, we should get a halved version of this import, where it's rasterizing at a half layer. It's creating an object at a half width and height. So really simple update. Excuse me. But you could pretty much take that script and do whatever you want to with it. So let's go ahead and re-import that SVG file. So now you can see, compared to its base form, it is now importing it basically half the resolution, half the height, half the width on a half-sized object. So you can kind of take this and run with it. If you wanted to import, if you wanted to add functionality to the SVG importer, say for different layer commands, for example, I know that SVG files can support animations in their layers. You could add that in there. The full source for all of our importers is available in those packages for you to work with. There we go. So not only could you modify the existing importers to behave or function however you wanted them to, you could also create your own importers. So you could use the basis of one of those importers to write your own object creation script, your own catalyzer, things like that. Or you could, again, modify or add to existing importers if you wanted to add functionality to it. You could also turn that into a package. Like I said, the base package system in GeoStudio is based on that Python API. So you could continue to make your own packages out of that or modify existing ones. Now, both for the SVG importer, I have some documentation added for that, as well as the Python script engine. I have documentation that covers from a base form what the Python system looks like, as well as a link to our API, our full API on the Python scripting API. And there are a few examples in there of what some Python scripts might look like. And this could be handy for maybe not even just importers. You could write batched importing calls, maybe from other HMI design tools that could convert objects from one type to another type. You could also use the Python script engine for pretty much anything in GeoStudio. If there's anything you wanted to script in GeoStudio, it could also be utilized for that. So some things that we covered today. We covered the base texturing system in GeoStudio, at least where that imports, where that resources tab is. And in fact, if we go back to GeoStudio and take a look at our resources tab, you can see as I've been importing all of these various design files, this is now filled out with a number of different textures that have been imported into our base texturing system. So even though it is a PSD import, it is still, for example, atlasing that texture and converting it to a PNG that's going to be loaded by GeoStudio. Same for the Figma file. Each of the Figma textures have been imported in here as their own resources. And you could still come in here and you can make modifications to the base import settings as far as whether it's going to be inline data, whether or not you want it to be compressed, things like that. So we also covered our Photoshop importer, how the nomenclature looks like within the layering, or what you want to name your layers, what different object types are supported, as well as the catalyzer system on top of that. So as you make changes to that Photoshop file, it will automatically catch those and re-import it in the editor. We covered our new Figma importer, which is importing designs from a web-based interface. The main thing to note there is that you're going to have to create the reference object and give it the URL for your actual design. You also need that access token. Again, we can get you documentation from Figma on exactly how you can get that access token so that you can use our importers. We covered the Ase Importer. So for one of our most robust importers for importing 3D models, that it supports all of the mesh data, all of the normal data, all the texture data, material data, as well as animations and lights in the scene. We covered the vector-based SVG importer, which allows you to just drag and drop vector-based textures right into GeoStudio, as well as rescale them and rasterize that texture, live inside of your editor design, as well as a very brief overview of the Python system that's within GeoStudio that most of these importers are based on, and that you have access to the Python source for all of these importers if you wanted to modify, add to, or even just take a look at how these importers are importing, and that you can utilize this to write your own importers for just about anything that our Python system can get access to. So, having gone through all of that, I'm going to go ahead and start addressing some of the questions that we might have. So I'm going to go ahead and take a look at the QA tab in here. So apologies, I wasn't able to see some of these questions as I was going through the webinar, but yes, currently the only way to speak is through text response, not through mic. Currently, I'm the only person who could speak as the webinar presenter, unfortunately. Since there are so many people, if we allowed mics, it would get pretty hectic. So I'll go ahead and add one here. So this question is, are these features in the editor customizable or are they fixed? So yes, they are fully customizable. You can go into the actual, again, you get the full source for these importers. So you can go into those scripts and you can fully customize exactly how these importers are functioning. I actually went to publish this one. I clicked on the wrong one. So here's another question. Does GeoStudio support importing Photoshop layers with effects and styles applied to them? Yes, GeoStudio can import those layers. The one caveat with that is that you will need to convert them to be a smart object in Photoshop. If you don't convert them to be a smart object, then it will somewhat ignore some of those styles and effects. So make sure if you are going to utilize those, that you convert that to a smart object. So shaders on 3D objects. So for our ES runtime, we do support the full shader pipeline. I'm not going to cover it fully here, but we'll just say that yes, you can add shaders into your design. You can apply them to 3D models or 2D models or even anything in your design, honestly, anything that's going to render. We do have examples of that. So if anybody does want an example of how to utilize shaders in GeoStudio from any sense of just a fade to full 3D effects, please let me know and I can pass along an example for that. So we'll go ahead and answer this one. So is it better practice to make layers within Photoshop or other editors first and then import them as textures into GeoStudio? Or is it okay to import individual images as textures and then layer and group them in GeoStudio? Both are perfectly valid ways to go about setting up your design. GeoStudio happens to support both. If you want to, in Photoshop, do your entire design and layering from Photoshop and then have that all import and ready to go in GeoStudio, you can do that. Otherwise, if you wanted to do individual textures per layer that you want to import and do those one at a time and then organize them in GeoStudio, that is also entirely supported. I guess it's going to depend on what sort of workflow you want to go for there. Personally, I would do it all in Photoshop because that's one less thing that I have to worry about as I'm going through my design. But again, both are entirely supported for whichever way you want to go. So yes, in case I didn't make this clear, in case I didn't make this clear, are SVG files converted as raster? I think I missed that point. Yes, the SVG files as a vector font are rasterized in GeoStudio as their own texture. So it's only an editor time feature. So as you scale and move that polygon that it's applied to, it will automatically re-rasterize that texture for the new scale. Once you generate and you're at runtime, it is now a rasterized texture. You're not going to be able to re-rasterize it at runtime, but at editor time, yes, it is going to be converted to a raster every time you rescale that object. So we'll grab this one. So is it possible to render a perspective view of a 3D model within an orthographic overlay? So yes, you could have a situation where, let's say, maybe you're making some sort of cluster or something that has a 2D orthographic overlay, but you also want to embed 3D elements within it. And say those 3D elements need to have that depth, but you still want to render your other 2D content in an orthographic manner. Yes, we do have an object in GeoStudio called a Multiview that allows you to take different views, whether they're orthographic or perspective, and stitch them together on the screen. So you can take multiple views with both 2D and 3D objects and put them all together on the screen in different projections. Let's see. Are there a lot of Figma users designing for avionics displays? I will say that Figma currently seems to have gotten a pretty big start on the automotive side of things, but it seems to be branching out and kind of infecting all fields. So yes, I do see more and more avionics projects that are using Figma or trying to fit Figma into their workflow. So it does seem to be a much more common thing. Which is one of the reasons why we added an importer for it into GeoStudio. So I'll touch on this one back onto Figma. Figma has a variety of animations and prototype wireframe relationships. Do any of these triggers, paths, or animations get brought into GeoStudio? So currently, no. Right now, it is just the frames and the nodes themselves. That's not to say that it wouldn't be impossible to add those. Just in its current form, it is just the actual frames themselves as well as the nodes. But again, we have both. You'll get the full source for the importer when you get it. So if you did want to kind of work with us on maybe adding certain features that you would want implemented into that, it could be something that is added, as long as the Figma Web API allows us to get what we need there. So I guess I'll go ahead and mention that if you are going to be writing your own importers, I'll go ahead and throw this out there that whatever design file or API you want to link up with for your importers, you know, it will need to, GeoCities will need to be able to get access to certain bits of data from them in order to construct objects or get textures from it. So if you are considering doing an importer for GeoStudio, that would probably be one of the first things that I research is what would an external interface have access to if they wanted to pull data from whatever design or design file you want to get to. So let's see, we'll grab this one. Apologies, I'm kind of sorting through all the questions in here. So if I were to write my own importer for GeoStudio, would I be able to add in, say, the automatic update functionality, I'm assuming for the catalyzer, or add drag and drop with different files that I'm supporting, like the existing importers have? So yes, if you are going to be writing your own importers into GeoStudio, say for a new file type, anything like that, you can not only add the importer functionality, but you can also add the catalyzer functionality on top of it to have that automatic update on a file change, or you can add support for dragging and dropping handling for certain file types to automatically run that importer. So all the functionality that I showed for dragging and dropping a Photoshop file into the editor, having it automatically update on changes, that full API for doing that is available with the package system and with our Python API. Let's see. So I'm gonna touch on this one. I think I may understand what it's referring to. Is it possible to write importers for whole projects, not only resources, i.e., converting a whole guide model or something like that? So yes, you can really import just about anything that's going to be converted into some sort of base object. It doesn't necessarily have to be for textures. So for example, let's say you have another HMI tool that has an entirely geometry-based design. It is entirely possible to take the geometry values of that design and import it into GeoStudio. You can do the conversion of those values from an entire project from another HMI tool and then convert that into the GeoStudio values. And I have some examples of that if you wanted to see what that might look like. But it is, this isn't just for, say, design tools. You could write an importer for just about anything that's going to turn into base geometry or a base object in GeoStudio, not just the texture portion of it. I'll touch on this one briefly. It goes a little bit off the importer topic, but I do think it still could be relevant. What kind of code is generated by dist function call or runtime library with what kind of code is generated by GeoStudio? What sort of runtime API does it use, and how was the code generated? So our code generator, we have three different ones. We have desktop, we have ES, and safety critical. Our safety critical code generator and runtime or DL178C DAL-A certified. They generate C++ code. So our entire runtime as well as our generated code is all in C++. We do have, I know you mentioned Simulink here. We do have a block set for Simulink plugin that allows you to take your GeoStudio content, put it into Simulink, and then you can drag the input and output values in the Simulink wireframe to kind of get those data IO values coming back and forth if you wanted to test that. So you can pretty much take that C++ code and compile it for really just about anywhere. You can put it into other simulations. You could build it as a shared library and integrate it into an entirely different platform. You can deploy it to embedded devices or RTOSes using OpenGL-SC on certified systems. There's really just about you can pretty much put GeoStudio just about anywhere that C++ and OpenGL is supported. Or if you're using GLS Micro, then it is possible to put it on a microprocessor. Okay, so I know there are other questions in here. I'm not quite going to get to them because either it might take us a little second to go through, or B, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I should cover it here. So if I haven't addressed your question just yet, please feel free to send an email to support@disty.com with your question, and we can talk then. Otherwise, like I said, this webinar has been recorded. Everyone will get a copy of this as well as the slides once it is processed. But again, if you have any further questions, if you want to have any further discussions with us about GeoStudio, about importing, or any other topics, feel free to reach out to support@disty.com. Otherwise, thank you very much for joining today. I hope everyone has a great day, and I'll see you all in the next webinar or the next time that I talk to you in support. Thank you very much.